Eric Carter moved through the ruins of Drulka 5 with quiet, practiced steps. The planet had once been a thriving colony before the war turned it into a graveyard. Now, it was a desolate wasteland. Shattered buildings, scorched ground, and silence so thick it made her skin crawl. Eric didn't mind the quiet, though. After years of war, silence felt like peace. He was scavenging for supplies when he heard the scream. It cut through the stillness like a blade, high-pitched and desperate. Eric froze, his pulse quickening. No one should be here. The planet had been abandoned for months. Slowly, he drew his rifle and moved toward the sound. He found her huddled against the cracked wall of a collapsed building. An alien woman, trembling and afraid. Her skin was a deep, luminous violet, her golden eyes wide with terror. Bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly along her arms and neck, casting a soft glow in the darkness. She was barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, and covered in bruises. When she saw Eric, she didn't run. Instead, she stumbled toward him and collapsed against his chest. "Please, help me," she whispered. Before Eric could respond, a sharp mechanical whine sounded overhead. He looked up and saw a hunter drone sweeping the area, its red sensors scanning the ruins. Whoever she was, someone was hunting her. And they had serious tech. Eric didn't ask questions. He grabbed her hand and ran. They ran through the ruins, Eric leading the way with quick, efficient movements. The woman stumbled, clearly exhausted, but she kept up. Behind them, the drone's whine grew louder. Eric pulled her into a narrow alley and pressed her against the wall, his body shielding hers as the drone passed by. They stayed still until the sound faded. When it was safe, Eric finally spoke. "Who are you? Why are they after you?" "My name is Zyra," she said, her voice shaking. I escaped." "Escaped from what?" Eric asked. But before she could answer, an explosion rocked the ruins. The hunters were getting closer. Eric swore under his breath and led Zyra deeper into the wreckage, heading for an old military outpost he'd been using as a hideout. They slipped inside just as more drones swept over the area. Inside, Eric locked the door and turned to her. "Start talking." She hesitated, then nodded. "I am Veltheri," she said. "My people, we were betrayed by the Galactic Council. They sold us to the Praxian Dominion. We were a peaceful race, scientists, artists, but the Praxians saw only slaves." Her voice cracked. "They destroyed our cities and took our people. I was supposed to be a gift for one of their warlords. A trophy." Eric felt a surge of anger. The Praxians were known for their cruelty, but this was worse than he'd imagined. "How did you escape?" "I stole something from them," she said. "A data crystal. It's inside me. Implanted. It holds the codes to deactivate their fleet's AI systems. If the rebels get it, they can end this war. If the Praxians get it back, they'll kill everyone who knows about it." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "That's why they're hunting me." 3. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance. The Praxians had sent more than drones. Eric peeked through a crack in the wall and saw armored vehicles moving through the ruins, accompanied by heavily armed mercenaries. He knew they wouldn't stop until they found her. "We can't stay here," he said. I can't run anymore," Zyra whispered, her legs trembling. Eric's soldier instincts kicked in. "Then we fight." He moved quickly, setting up traps with scavenged explosives and rigging old security systems to create a defensive perimeter. Zyra watched him with wide eyes. You're going to fight them. For me." "Yeah," Eric said without looking up. "Seems like you're worth fighting for." The first wave came at dusk. Drones flew ahead, but Eric's traps took them out in a series of fiery explosions. When the mercenaries advanced, Eric picked them off with precise, controlled shots. But they kept coming. He fought like a man possessed, every move calculated and deadly. But there were too many. During a firefight, Eric took a hit, a grazing shot to his side. He fell back, blood soaking his shirt. Zyra dragged him to safety, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against the wound. "Stay with me," she begged. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice weak. 4. The night passed in a haze of pain and fear. Eric drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time he woke, Zyra was there, watching over him. When morning came, he was still alive, barely. "We can't stay," he said through gritted teeth. "They'll come back." I don't believe you," Zyra whispered. But they didn't get a choice. The Praxians attacked again, this time led by their warlord, Karish. He was a towering figure, more machine than alien, his body enhanced with cybernetic implants. Eric's bullets barely slowed him down. Karish cornered them in the outpost's command room. Eric was too weak to fight, his vision swimming. Zyra stood in front of him, trying to protect him. "Please," she begged, "let him go. He's done nothing." Karish struck her, sending her sprawling. Eric saw red. With the last of his strength, he launched himself at the warlord. They fought. A brutal, desperate struggle. But Karish was too strong. He slammed Eric against the wall, and the world went dark. 5. When Eric woke, he expected pain. But instead, he heard silence. Zyra knelt beside him, her hands shaking. Karish lay dead on the floor, a stolen energy blade buried in his chest. I had to," she whispered, her eyes wide and horrified. "He was going to kill you." Eric reached for her hand. "You did good." The fight was over, but their battle wasn't. The data crystal was still inside her, and the Praxians would never stop hunting her. Eric knew there was only one way to end this. "We take the fight to them," he said. 6. Eric called for help using a distress beacon. Human reinforcements arrived, and they finally had a chance to breathe. But Zyra wasn't safe yet. The Praxians launched a full-scale assault on the planet, determined to reclaim their prize. The final battle was chaos. Orbital bombardments lit up the sky, and the ground shook with explosions. Eric fought alongside human and rebel forces, his injuries forgotten in the heat of battle. Zyra stayed by his side, using a salvaged weapon to defend herself. When the Praxian fleet descended, Zyra activated the data crystal. The code spread through the enemy's network like wildfire. Ships fell from the sky, their AI systems shutting down. The Dominion's war machines turned to scrap. The battle ended with the Praxians' defeat, but the victory came at a cost. Many had fallen, and the planet lay in ruins. As the survivors gathered their dead, Eric found Zyra sitting alone, her eyes on the horizon. "You don't have to leave," he said softly. She looked at him, her golden eyes filled with hope and fear. "Where would I go?" Eric took her hand. "Stay with me." And as the sun rose over the broken world, they stood together, two survivors, ready to face whatever came next too. The room was dim, lit only by the soft, flickering light of an old console in a corner. Eric Carter sat across from Zyra, his sharp eyes watching her closely. The air between them was thick with tension. She looked fragile, her violet skin marred by bruises, her golden eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. But there was something else there, something deeper, desperation. Eric finally broke the silence. "You said you escaped. Escaped from what?" Zyra hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The Praxian Dominion," she said. They took my people, enslaved us. We were scientists, artists, peaceful. We had no weapons, no armies. They destroyed everything." Her voice cracked, and her eyes filled with tears. "I watched them burn my city, my family. They didn't survive." Eric's stomach twisted. He'd heard of the Praxians, an empire built on conquest and cruelty. But this was genocide. "How did you get away?" he asked softly. "I was taken," she said, her voice breaking. "A trophy for one of their warlords. But I knew I couldn't let them use me. I stole something. Something they need. A data crystal. It has the access codes for their entire fleet's AI systems. Without those systems, their ships are just metal shells. She looked up at him, her golden eyes pleading. It's inside me. Implanted. Eric stared at her, stunned. This wasn't just some refugee. She was carrying the key to ending a war. That's why they're hunting you, he said, the pieces falling into place. Yes, she whispered. If they get it back, they'll wipe out every rebel colony. Every planet that stands against them. Please, you have to help me. Before Eric could answer, the sound of engines rumbled in the distance. He moved to the window and saw them. Praxian ships sweeping over the ruins, searchlights cutting through the darkness. They had found them. We need to move, he said, grabbing his gear. Now, Zyra didn't argue. She followed him out into the night, the fear in her eyes mirrored by the cold determination in his. 3. They ran through the crumbling remains of Drulka 5, the air thick with dust and the scent of ash. Eric led the way, his senses on high alert. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound sent a spike of adrenaline through his veins. Behind them, the Praxians advanced. The whine of their hunter drones echoed through the ruins, followed by the heavy clank of armored walkers. Eric knew they wouldn't stop until they had Zyra, or until they were both dead. This way, he called, pulling her into a narrow alley. They pressed against the wall as a drone passed overhead, its red sensors scanning the street below. When it moved on, Eric exhaled slowly. We can't outrun them forever. We need a plan. Zyra nodded, her face pale. There's a rebel outpost, about 50 kilometers from here. If we can reach it. A deafening explosion cut her off. The ground shook, and Eric pushed her down just as debris rained from above. The Praxians were closing in. We won't make it on foot, Eric said grimly. We need transport. He led her toward an old supply depot he'd scouted earlier. If they were lucky, there might still be a working vehicle inside. But luck hadn't exactly been on their side. When they reached the depot, the doors were sealed tight. Eric set to work on the lock, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. Behind them, the sound of approaching troops grew louder. Hurry, Zyra whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I'm trying, Eric grunted. The lock finally clicked, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, the depot was dark and silent, until Eric spotted it. An old military hovercraft, battered but intact. He climbed into the cockpit and powered it up. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Get in, he shouted. Zyra scrambled into the passenger seat as Eric hit the throttle. The hovercraft shot forward, bursting through the doors just as the first Praxian soldiers arrived. Gunfire sparked off the hull, but they were already moving too fast. Eric grinned. Hold on tight. 4. The chase was brutal. Praxian skimmers pursued them across the desolate landscape, firing bursts of plasma that scorched the ground around them. Eric weaved through the ruins, pushing the hovercraft to its limits. Can't this thing go any faster? Zyra shouted, her eyes wide. I'm working on it. Eric shot back. He spotted a canyon ahead, a narrow gap that would be impossible for the larger skimmers to follow. Brace yourself, he warned. The hovercraft hit the edge of the canyon at full speed, soaring through the air before slamming down on the rocky path below. The skimmers tried to follow, but one misjudged the jump and exploded in a ball of fire. Nice shot, Zyra said breathlessly. Wasn't me, Eric replied with a grin. They sped through the canyon, finally losing their pursuers. When they emerged on the other side, the landscape stretched out in a vast, empty expanse. The rebel outpost was still far away, but they had a chance. 5. As night fell, they set up camp in the shadow of an old mining rig. Eric sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Zyra sat beside him, her body tense with exhaustion and fear. "You saved my life," she said softly. "Not the first time," Eric replied with a shrug. "Won't be the last." She looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face. "Why? Why would you risk yourself for me?" Eric's expression softened. "Because someone has to stand up to them. And because I couldn't just leave you behind." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since they'd met, there was a sense of calm. But calm never lasted long in war. Just before dawn, the Praxians found them. The first explosion tore through the camp, sending Eric and Zyra scrambling for cover. Gunfire erupted, and Eric returned fire, picking off soldiers with precise shots. "We can't hold them off," Zyra shouted. "We don't have to," Eric replied. "We just need to reach the outpost." 6. They ran again, but this time the enemy was too close. Eric took a hit, a grazing shot to his side that left him bleeding and weak. Zyra tried to support him, her face pale with fear. "I won't leave you," she whispered. "You might not have a choice," Eric replied, his vision swimming. The outpost was so close. He could see the lights in the distance, but the Praxians were closing in. And then, just when hope seemed lost, a rebel gunship roared overhead, laying down a hail of fire that drove the enemy back. They made it to the outpost's gates just as Eric's legs gave out. He collapsed, and the last thing he saw was Zyra's face, her golden eyes filled with tears. When he woke, he was in a medical bay, his wounds bandaged and his body aching. Zyra sat beside him, her hand clasped tightly around his. "You made it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. "Not without you," he replied. The fight wasn't over. He knew that. But with Zyra's help, they had a weapon that could end the war. And for the first time in a long while, Eric felt hope. Together, they would finish this. "You said." The wind howled through the ruins of Drelka 5, carrying the scent of ash and decay. Eric kept his grip tight on the hovercraft's controls, his eyes flicking between the rocky terrain ahead and the darkening sky behind them. The sun was slipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the wreckage of a once thriving colony. In the distance, the faint hum of engines grew louder. The Praxians were closing in. Zyra sat next to him, her hands clutching the edge of her seat. Her golden eyes darted toward the back of the vehicle every few seconds, as if she expected the enemy to burst through the gloom at any moment. Fear radiated off her in waves, but there was something else beneath it, something colder. Determination. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "I know," Eric replied, his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart. "But we're not gonna make it easy for them." The hovercraft jolted as they hit a patch of uneven ground, and Eric fought to keep it steady. The engine sputtered for a second before roaring back to life. They couldn't afford a breakdown, not with the Praxians hunting them like wolves. "We need to find cover," Zyra said, her voice tense. "If they send air scouts." "They already have," Eric interrupted. He gestured toward the sky, where the faint red glow of search drones flitted like fireflies against the night. "They'll spot us in the open. We need to lose them." Ahead, the ground sloped down into a wide ravine, its rocky walls jagged and uneven. It wasn't ideal. If they got boxed in, there would be no way out. But Eric didn't see any better options. He angled the hovercraft toward the opening, pushing the throttle forward. The instant they dipped into the ravine, the sound of the engines behind them grew sharper. Eric risked a glance over his shoulder, and his stomach tightened. 3 Praxian skimmers followed in tight formation, their sleek, black hulls glinting in the moonlight. They were faster, more maneuverable, and heavily armed. "Hold on," Eric shouted. The first shots streaked past them, bolts of red plasma sizzling against the rock walls. Eric twisted the hovercraft into a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding an explosion that sent shards of stone flying in all directions. Zyra cried out, ducking as debris rained down around them. "They're gaining on us," she warned. "Not for long." Eric's eyes locked onto a narrow gap ahead, a tight space barely wide enough for their craft. If the Praxians wanted to follow, they'd have to risk it. The hovercraft shot through the gap with inches to spare, skidding against the walls and leaving a trail of sparks in its wake. One of the skimmers attempted to follow, but the pilot misjudged the angle. The sound of metal scraping rock filled the air, followed by a deafening explosion. "One down," Eric muttered. But the victory was short-lived. The remaining skimmers adjusted their course, firing relentlessly. The hovercraft shuddered as a glancing hit scorched its side, and warning lights flashed across the console. They couldn't take much more of this. "We're not going to make it." Zyra's voice cracked with fear. "Yes, we are," Eric growled. His eyes scanned the ravine ahead. And then he saw it. A crumbling outcropping of rock jutted over the path, barely hanging on. If they timed it right. "Zyra, when I say, hit the stabilizer override." "What?" "That'll disable." "Just do it." The hovercraft hurtled toward the outcropping, the skimmers right on their tail. Eric waited until the last possible second. Now. Zyra slammed the override, and the stabilizers cut out. The hovercraft tilted wildly, sliding sideways just as they passed beneath the outcropping. Eric fired the rear thrusters, and the sudden burst of force sent them spinning out of danger. Behind them, the skimmers weren't so lucky. The first crashed into the falling rocks with a deafening crunch, while the second veered sharply, too sharply. It slammed into the ravine wall and erupted in flames. Eric pulled the hovercraft back under control, his breathing ragged. For the first time since the chase began, there was silence. "They're gone," Zyra whispered. "For now," Eric replied grimly. He knew the Praxians wouldn't give up that easily. The ravine opened up into a wide plain, and Eric spotted a cluster of ruins ahead. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. He guided the hovercraft toward the crumbling structures and brought it to a stop behind a collapsed building. As the engine powered down, the night settled in around them. Eric climbed out, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Nothing yet, but that wouldn't last. Zyra sat on the edge of the hovercraft, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "You saved us," she said softly. "Not yet," Eric replied. "But I will." They needed a new plan, and fast, because the hunters were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. The night was cold and silent, but Eric knew it was a fragile peace. The Praxians wouldn't take their losses lightly. They'd be back, and soon. He stood at the edge of the ruined building, his eyes sweeping the horizon. The distant hills were painted silver under the moonlight, and the wind carried whispers of movement he couldn't quite place. They had a little time, but not much. Behind him, Zyra sat with her back against the hovercraft, trying to steady her breathing. She looked exhausted, her violet skin smudged with dirt and her golden eyes clouded with worry. Eric could see the fear in her face, but there was something else too. A fire, a quiet resilience that hadn't been there when they first met. "We can't keep running," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. "They'll find us again." "I know," Eric replied. He turned to face her, his expression hard. "That's why we're not going to run anymore. We're going to fight back." Her eyes widened. "Fight back?" "Against the Praxians. You saw their weapons, their ships. We're just two people. Two people who know how to survive," Eric said. "And if we keep running, they'll catch us. If we stand and fight, we have a chance." Zyra hesitated, fear and hope warring on her face. "But how? We don't have their firepower." "No," Eric agreed. "But we don't need it. We just need to be smarter." He crouched next to the hovercraft and started digging through the supplies. His fingers found a small metal case, and when he flipped it open, a slow grin spread across his face. Inside were a handful of EMP charges, primitive compared to Praxian tech, but devastating if used right. "These," he said, holding one up, "they'll knock out their systems long enough for us to hit back." Zaira stared at the device, her expression uncertain. "And then what? Even if we disable them, they'll just send more." "Not if we take out their command ship," Eric said. "Cut off the head, and the body falls apart. The Praxians aren't invincible. They just want everyone to think they are." For a long moment, Zaira was silent. Then she nodded, determination hardening her features. "What do you need me to do?" They worked quickly, laying their trap. The ruined buildings provided good cover, and Eric set the EMP charges in key positions while Zaira kept watch. Every now and then, she glanced toward him, her eyes filled with questions she hadn't yet asked. When they were finally ready, they settled into position. Eric lay on his stomach behind a pile of rubble, his rifle trained on the path they'd come from. Zaira knelt beside him, her own weapon held tightly in her hands. The night stretched on, heavy and tense. And then they came. The first sign was the distant hum of engines, low and menacing. Eric's grip tightened on his rifle as the lights of the skimmers appeared on the horizon. They moved slowly this time, more cautious after their earlier losses. A larger shadow loomed behind them, the command ship, sleek and deadly. "Wait for it," Eric whispered. The skimmers entered the ruins, weaving between the buildings as they searched. The command ship hovered above, scanning the ground with beams of harsh white light. Eric's finger hovered over the detonator. "Come on," he muttered. One of the skimmers passed directly over the first charge. Eric pressed the button. The explosion of blue light was silent but devastating. The skimmer shuddered and dropped, its systems fried instantly. The others spun toward the source of the attack, and Eric fired. His shot took the lead skimmer's pilot through the windshield, and the craft crashed into the ground with a deafening roar. "Now," Eric shouted. Zaira hit the second detonator, and another EMP burst lit the night. The command ship's lights flickered, and Eric saw his chance. He fired again and again, targeting the exposed engine ports. Sparks erupted, and the ship began to list, struggling to maintain altitude. But the Praxians weren't going down without a fight. Plasma fire rained down from the command ship's turrets, turning the ruins into a storm of heat and shrapnel. Eric grabbed Zaira's arm and pulled her behind cover just as a nearby wall exploded. "We need to take out that ship," she shouted over the noise. "Working on it," Eric yelled back. He reloaded his rifle and peeked around the corner. The command ship was low, its systems still struggling against the EMP. "If they could get one more good hit." "Cover me," he said. Before she could protest, Eric broke into a run. Plasma bolts scorched the ground around him, but he didn't stop. He reached the last EMP charge and yanked it free, then sprinted toward the command ship. "Eric." Zaira's voice was panicked, but he didn't slow down. The ship's underside was only a few meters above the ground, its engines sputtering. Eric skidded to a halt beneath it, set the charge, and slammed his fist against the activation switch. "Go, go, go," he shouted, running back toward the ruins. The blast hit just as he reached cover. The shockwave knocked him off his feet, but when he looked up, the command ship was falling. It hit the ground with a thunderous crash, flames erupting from its hull. For a moment, there was silence, and then Zaira was there, pulling him to his feet. "You're insane," she said, breathless. "Maybe," Eric replied, grinning, but it worked. The remaining skimmers were retreating, their confidence shattered. Eric watched them go, his heart still pounding. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but they'd won this battle, and for the first time, they had hope. The wreckage of the Praxian command ship still smoldered as dawn broke over the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of burned metal and scorched earth, and the ruins around them lay silent, battered but standing. Eric stood at the edge of the debris field, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The enemy had retreated for now, but they wouldn't stay gone for long. Behind him, Zyra crouched beside one of the fallen skimmers, working to salvage whatever she could. Her violet skin was streaked with dirt, her golden eyes focused with determination despite the exhaustion written all over her face. She'd barely spoken since the fight ended, but Eric could feel the tension radiating off her. "They'll be back," she said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was soft but steady. "We hurt them, but the Praxians don't forgive, and they never forget." "I know," Eric replied. He turned toward her, his face grim. "But we bought ourselves time, and we're going to use it." Zyra nodded, but there was something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Fear, yes, but something more than that. Something deeper. "Zyra, what aren't you telling me?" She froze, her hand stilling on the skimmer's control panel. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, without looking at him, she said, "They won't stop until they have me. You know that." "Yeah," Eric said quietly. "But why? What makes you so important?" When she finally met his gaze, her eyes were filled with pain. "Because I'm the last." The word hung between them, heavy and cold. "The last what?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The last of my line," Zyra said. "My people, the Praxians destroyed them, wiped out entire colonies. My family, my whole world, gone. And I'm the only one left." Eric's throat tightened. He'd seen what the Praxians were capable of, but hearing it like this made it all the more real. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. Zyra shook her head, brushing away tears that threatened to fall. "Sorry won't bring them back. But I can't let them take me, Eric. If they do, they'll win. They'll finish what they started." "They won't take you," Eric said fiercely. "Not while I'm breathing." A sudden noise cut through the morning stillness. The low, distant hum of engines. Eric's body tensed instantly, his hand going to his rifle. "They're coming," Zyra whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. "Then we make our stand," Eric said. They moved quickly, setting up defenses in the ruins. Eric laid down what few explosives they had left, while Zyra rigged the skimmer's power core to overload, turning it into a makeshift bomb. By the time the first Praxian ships appeared on the horizon, they were as ready as they could be. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The enemy force was larger than before, not just skimmers this time, but heavy walkers and aerial drones. The ground trembled as the machines advanced, and Eric felt a cold knot of fear settle in his stomach. "We can't fight them all," Zyra said, her voice shaking. "We don't have to," Eric replied. "We just have to hold them off long enough." Long enough for what? Before he could answer, the first wave hit. Plasma bolts rained down, turning the ruins into a war zone. Eric fired back, taking down drones and soldiers with deadly precision. Beside him, Zyra fought with fierce determination, her shots never missing their mark. But they were outnumbered, and it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out. A blast rocked their position, sending Eric sprawling. Dazed, he pushed himself up, and saw Zyra lying motionless a few feet away. His heart seized. "Zyra." He crawled to her side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. Relief flooded him when he found it, but it was faint. She was alive, but barely. "No," he whispered. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." But there was no time. The Praxians were closing in, and their defenses were failing. Eric's mind raced. He couldn't let them take her. He wouldn't. With a surge of desperation, he activated the skimmer's overloaded core. The ground beneath them began to vibrate, the hum growing louder and more dangerous. He gathered Zyra in his arms and ran. Plasma fire chased them, but Eric didn't stop. He ran until his legs burned, until his lungs screamed for air, and still he kept going. Behind them, the skimmer exploded. The shockwave knocked him off his feet, and he hit the ground hard, shielding Zyra with his body. When he looked back, the ruins were gone, and so were most of the Praxians. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A lone walker emerged from the smoke, its guns training on them. Eric's heart pounded. He was out of time, and out of options. He laid Zyra down gently and stood, his rifle raised. If this is how it ends, he muttered, then so be it. The walker fired, and something slammed into it from above. A streak of fire and metal crashed into the machine, sending it toppling with a deafening roar. Eric stared, stunned, as a human dropship landed in the clearing. Soldiers poured out, weapons blazing, cutting down the remaining Praxians with brutal efficiency. When the dust settled, a familiar figure approached. Eric. He turned, his eyes widening. Bonner. The other soldier grinned. You didn't think we'd leave you out here, did you? Eric let out a shaky breath, his knees threatening to give out. You have no idea how glad I am to see you. Bonner's gaze shifted to Zyra, concern flickering across his face. She okay? She will be, Eric said. But we need to get her out of here. Now. The dropship lifted off minutes later, the battlefield shrinking below them. Eric sat with Zyra's head in his lap, his fingers brushing through her hair. We made it, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her lips curving into a weak smile. You kept your promise. Always, Eric said softly. And as the ship carried them toward safety, he knew their fight wasn't over. But they'd face whatever came next together. The air inside the human dropship was thick with tension. Eric sat with Zyra, resting in his arms, her breathing shallow but steady. The battle was over for now, but he knew the Praxians wouldn't stop hunting them. He looked across at Bonner, who was checking his rifle, his face grim. The other soldiers on board were quiet, their expressions hardened from the fight they had just left behind. Zyra stirred slightly, her golden eyes blinking open. She looked up at Eric, her gaze filled with exhaustion and something else. Gratitude. He gave her a small smile, brushing a stray lock of violet hair from her face. You're safe, he said softly. For now, she whispered back. But they will come. Bonner nodded, his voice serious. She's right. The Praxians don't take losses lightly. They'll send reinforcements, and they'll keep coming until they get what they want. Eric clenched his fists. Then we take the fight to them. The dropship shook slightly as they entered the hangar bay of a human battlecruiser. The moment the doors opened, medics rushed forward to take Zyra. She resisted at first, her fingers gripping Eric's arm. I'm not leaving you, he assured her. I'll be right here. She hesitated before finally letting go, allowing the medics to carry her away. Eric turned to Bonner, his jaw set. We need to hit them before they regroup. Bonner nodded. Agreed. Command already has a plan in motion. We intercepted Praxian communications. There's a fleet assembling at a nearby station. If we strike now, we can cripple them before they get the chance to retaliate. How much time do we have? Not much, Bonner admitted. A few hours, at best. Eric exhaled sharply. He knew what needed to be done. There was no time for rest. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. The battlecruiser's crew worked tirelessly, loading weapons, coordinating strike teams, and planning their assault. Eric barely had a moment to think before the alarm sounded, signaling their approach. Zyra, now bandaged but still weak, found him just before he boarded his assault ship. You're going, she said, her voice quiet. I have to, he replied. This is our best chance to stop them. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. Then come back to me. I will, he promised. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace, right on the edge of the Praxian stronghold. The space station loomed ahead, massive and fortified, with enemy ships swarming around it. Eric gritted his teeth as the battle began. Missiles and laser fire filled the void, ships exploding in bursts of light. Eric's assault team launched in drop pods, hurtling toward the station. The impact was violent, but he barely registered it before he was on his feet, weapon raised. The corridors of the station were chaos. Human soldiers clashed with Praxian warriors in brutal close-quarters combat. Eric moved with deadly efficiency, cutting down enemies as he pushed forward. His objective was clear: reach the command center and disable their fleet coordination. Bonner fought beside him, covering his flank. "We need to move, now." Eric kicked open a blast door, revealing a large control room filled with Praxian officers. The moment they saw him, they reached for their weapons, but he was faster. Gunfire erupted. The fight was short but vicious. Eric took down the last enemy and rushed to the console, hacking into the system. "Bonner, set the charges," he ordered. The explosives were in place within minutes. The moment they detonated, the station's defenses would collapse, leaving the Praxian fleet vulnerable. "Time to go," Bonner shouted. They ran, dodging enemy fire as they made their escape. The station shook as explosions rocked its core. Eric barely made it back to the drop pod before the entire structure started collapsing. As they launched back to the battlecruiser, Eric watched through the viewport as the station was consumed in fire. The human fleet pressed the attack, tearing through the now disorganized Praxian ships. By the time they docked, the battle was won. Eric stepped off the drop pod, his body aching but his mind sharp. He scanned the hangar, and there she was. Zyra stood there, waiting. The moment their eyes met, she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered against his chest. "We did it," he corrected, holding her tightly. The war wasn't over. The Praxians would regroup, and new battles would come. But for now, in this moment, they had won. And as long as they fought together, Eric knew they always had a chance. A new beginning had just begun.